The dead don't always rest. Sometimes they linger in hospital corridors, watching, waiting. A chaplain has spent years comforting the dying, only to realize some patients aren't alone in their final moments. They're visited by figures in outdated uniforms, whispering words no living soul should hear. What he witnessed in room 407 would shake even the most hardened believer, because the dead don't just appear to say goodbye. Some come to collect. What happened next defies all logic, but the security footage doesn't lie. You won't believe what the cameras captured. But let's start from the beginning. The fluorescent lights hummed softly overhead as I walked the empty hospital corridor, my footsteps echoing against the linoleum floor. Hospitals never truly sleep, but at this hour, somewhere between midnight and dawn, the world outside these walls fades away, leaving only the steady beep of monitors and the occasional murmur of nurses on their rounds. I've spent years in these halls as a chaplain, bearing witness to the fragile boundary between life and death. Most believe hospitals are places of healing, and they are, but they're also something else. Crossroads, where the veil between worlds grows thin, where the dying sometimes see what the living cannot. Mr. Holloway's room was at the end of the hall, bathed in the dim glow of a single bedside lamp. He had been with us for weeks, a frail man in his 80s with no family left to visit him, no phone calls to lift his spirits. Just the quiet company of machines, measuring the slow decline of his body. That night, the nurses called me to his room. His vitals were dropping, and they knew his time was near. I entered quietly, the scent of antiseptic and aged skin filling the air. His chest rose and fell in shallow, uneven breaths, his paper-thin eyelids fluttering as if caught in some distant dream. I took his hand, cold and brittle in mine, and began to pray. The words came easily, a familiar rhythm of comfort and farewell. I spoke of peace, of rest, of a light beyond this world. He didn't respond, didn't squeeze my hand, or murmur in acknowledgement. But I've learned that the dying hear more than we realize. Sometimes, in their final moments, they understand everything. When I finished, I sat with him in silence, the only sound the rhythmic hiss of the oxygen machine. Then, without warning, the steady line of his heart monitor flattened into a single unbroken tone. A nurse rushed in, checking for a pulse, but I already knew. Mr. Holloway was gone. I lingered for a moment, offering one last silent prayer before gathering my things. As I stepped toward the door, something made me pause. A feeling, a whisper of unease, slithering down my spine. I turned back, glancing through the partially open door. And that's when I saw him. Mr. Holloway was sitting up, not slumped, not shifting in some final reflex, but upright, rigid, his spine straight as a rod against the pillows. His hands lay stiffly on the sheets, fingers splayed like claws, and his face, God, his face. His skin was waxen, his mouth slightly open, his eyes fixed on the far corner of the room with an intensity that made my breath catch. I told myself it was a trick of the light, a muscle spasm, locking his body in place. But then his lips moved. Just a twitch at first. Then a slow, deliberate parting. No breath stirred in his lungs. No pulse thrummed in his throat. Yet from that lifeless mouth came a sound. A whisper, dry and hollow, like wind through dead leaves. "You see me." The words slithered into the air, curling around me like smoke. I didn't wait to hear more. I stumbled back, my heart hammering against my ribs, and fled into the bright safety of the hallway. The next morning, the nurses found him exactly as I'd left him, still sitting up, still staring at that empty corner. The doctors called it an unusual case of rigor mortis, a quirk of biology. The nurses whispered otherwise. They avoided that end of the hall after dark, hurry past room 407 without glancing inside. And sometimes, when the night was at its quietest, they swore they could still see him, a shadowy figure propped up in bed, his hollow gaze fixed on something just beyond the edge of our world. I've carried that night with me ever since. Because in that moment, I understood something terrible. Death isn't always an end. Sometimes it's a door. And some doors, once opened, refuse to stay closed. But Mr. Holloway wasn't the only one who refused to leave quietly. Weeks later, as I walked another lonely corridor, I saw a man standing where no living soul should have been. He was dressed in a hospital gown, his hands folded as if in prayer, his eyes locked onto mine. And then, just like that, he vanished. What I learned next would shake me to my core, because the dead don't always come for comfort. Sometimes they come to warn us. The hospital's fourth floor always had a particular stillness after midnight. Not peaceful, but watchful, as if the building itself was holding its breath. I'd just left room 412, where Mrs. Calloway, a terminal cancer patient, had finally found sleep after hours of labored breathing. The morphine drip kept her comfortable, but I knew these were her final days. As I turned down the long corridor toward the nursing station, the overhead lights flickered. Not unusual in this aging building, but enough to make my footsteps hesitate. That's when I saw him. At the far end of the hall, just outside room 418, stood a man in a faded hospital gown. His posture was unnaturally straight, hands clasped before him like a priest about to administer last rites. What struck me first wasn't his sudden appearance, but the absolute stillness of him. Hospital gowns billow with movement, but his hung limp as if no body filled it. The pale green fabric looked decades out of date, the kind we stopped using years ago. I took a step forward, my rubber-soled shoes silent on the linoleum. "Sir?" My voice echoed slightly in the empty corridor. He didn't react, didn't turn, just stood there, staring at the closed door of 418. The air grew colder with each step I took toward him, my breath beginning to fog despite the hospital's constant climate control. 3 paces away, I reached out and he dissolved. Not like someone walking away, but like smoke in reverse, particles unraveling into nothingness, until only the empty hallway remained. A shiver crawled up my spine that had nothing to do with the sudden chill. I turned to room 418's door, hand hovering over the handle. Inside, Mr. Delaney, an 83-year-old with advanced pneumonia, lay wheezing beneath oxygen tubes. His daughter Sarah slept curled in the visitor's chair, her face streaked with dried tears. The heart monitor beeped erratically, each spike smaller than the last. Nurse Hernandez looked up from adjusting the IV bag, her eyebrows lifting in silent question. "Did you see a man out here just now?" I whispered. She shook her head, glancing toward the empty hallway. Before she could respond, the cardiac monitor flatlined with that terrible, endless tone. We moved with practiced efficiency, Hernandez calling a code while I gently guided Sarah into the hallway. The crash team arrived in seconds, but I knew from the way Mr. Delaney's mouth had gone slack that he was already gone. As the commotion continued inside, Sarah collapsed against my shoulder, sobbing into my chaplain's robe. That's when Hernandez emerged, her dark skin gone ashen. She pulled me aside, her voice barely audible over the code blue chaos. "Chaplain, that patient, Mr. Delaney. When I was prepping him this afternoon," she swallowed hard. "He described exactly what you saw. A man in an old hospital gown, hands folded, waiting by his door." Her fingers trembled against my arm. "He said the man told him not to be afraid, that it would be quick." I looked back down the empty hallway, the hair on my neck rising. This wasn't like Mr. Holloway's angry, grasping spirit. This presence had been peaceful, almost comforting. Over the next weeks, I pored through old admission records and discovered something that made my coffee go cold. 34 years ago, a chaplain named Father Michael had died of a sudden aneurysm in that very hallway. The nurses who'd worked here longest still spoke of how he'd refused to leave his patients, even as the headache tore through his brain, how he'd collapsed right outside room 418 while checking on a terminal case. I thought I understood hospital ghosts after that. Some lost, some comforting. Then came the night I was called to the abandoned East Wing, where something far older and darker waited. They'd moved all patients out for renovations, but as I stood before that rusting elevator door, the intercom crackled with the nurse's frantic voice. "Chaplain, we have a code violet in East 307. The patient says there's a woman in her room, but East Wing's been empty for months." The elevator shuddered downward, and in its scratched metal doors, I saw the reflection of something moving behind me. Something with eyes like spilled ink. The East Wing had been closed for renovations for 3 weeks when the call came in. I was reviewing charts in the chaplain's office when the intercom buzzed with Nurse Wilkins' voice, strained through static. "Code Violet, East Wing room 307. Patient reports an intruder." My pen froze mid-sentence. The East Wing was supposed to be empty. We'd transferred every patient out before construction began. The walk there felt longer than usual, my footsteps echoing through the connecting corridor where the working lights gave way to temporary construction bulbs, their orange glow casting long shadows that seemed to move just beyond my peripheral vision. The automatic doors to East Wing hissed open reluctantly, revealing a hallway swallowed in darkness, save for the emergency exit signs bleeding red onto peeling linoleum. Room 307's door stood slightly ajar, a sliver of blackness gaping like a hungry mouth. My fingers found the light switch by memory, but when I flipped it, nothing happened. The beam from my flashlight cut through the dust motes swirling in the air, revealing overturned furniture and plastic sheets draped over medical equipment. In the far corner, a figure sat perfectly still in one of the visitors' chairs. A woman. Her hospital gown was the old-style pale blue we hadn't used since the 90s, the fabric thin and yellowed at the edges. Tangled hair obscured her face as she stared at the floor, her bare feet pale against the tile. My breath fogged suddenly in air gone Arctic. "Ma'am," I said, stepping closer. "This area's restricted." Her head snapped up with a speed no living neck could manage. The flashlight beam caught her face full on, and my stomach dropped. Where eyes should have been were two pits of absolute blackness. Not just dark, but void, like someone had scooped out her sockets and filled them with liquid shadow. Her lips stretched into a smile far too wide for her face, revealing teeth that looked filed to points. Before I could move, she dissolved, not fading, but unraveling strand by strand, like smoke caught in reverse wind, until only the empty chair remained. The cold lingered, though, pressing against my skin like icy fingers. Back at the nurse's station, Wilkins frowned at my shaking hands. "There's no one in East Wing, Chaplain. We cleared it last month." I insisted on seeing the patient records anyway. The computer screen flickered as it pulled up room 307's history. In 1993, a 24-year-old woman named Elise Cartwright had been admitted after a botched back alley abortion. She'd bled out right there in that room when the night nurse failed to check on her for 6 hours. The subsequent lawsuit shut down the maternity ward permanently. Wilkins turned pale when I showed her the file. "That's impossible," she whispered. "They demolished that room during the 2002 remodel. There hasn't been a room 307 in East Wing for nearly 20 years. That night, I dreamt of black eyes watching from the corner of my bedroom. When I jerked awake at 3:07 a.m., the digital clock's glow illuminated a single wet footprint on the tile beside my bed, the shape unmistakably female, the edges already evaporating. The next morning, maintenance found 3 construction workers unconscious in the East Wing hallway. They all told the same story. A weeping woman in an old hospital gown had begged them for help, then attacked when they approached. Security footage showed only the men screaming at empty air. I thought I'd seen every kind of ghost hospitals could hold: the angry, the lost, the vengeful. Then came the night shift when Mr. Howard, a terminal COPD patient, told me about the nurse who visited him after midnight. She wore one of those old white dresses with the caps, he wheezed, gripping my hand with surprising strength. Held my wrist to check my pulse, but her fingers, they went right through me. When I checked the archives, I found her photo. Nurse Helen Pierce, head floor nurse from 1952 until her death in 1987. The record said she died peacefully in her sleep. The security footage from Mr. Howard's room told a different story. At exactly 2:13 a.m., the heart monitor flatlined. But for 12 seconds after clinical death, the camera showed Helen's translucent form, still sitting beside him, stroking his hair as his lips moved in words the audio couldn't capture. Some spirits don't haunt hospitals. They keep working. The cardiac ward was unusually quiet that evening, the kind of silence that settles over hospitals when death is near. I was making my rounds when Nurse Carter intercepted me outside room 214, her face drawn tight with something more than exhaustion. "Mr. Howard's asking for you," she said, her voice low. "He's been talking about a nurse no one else can see." The moment I stepped into his room, the scent of antiseptic and impending mortality filled my nostrils. Howard lay propped up on pillows, his emaciated frame barely making an impression on the mattress. The COPD had ravaged his lungs for years, and now his breathing came in shallow, wet gasps that echoed through the oxygen mask. But his eyes, those were alarmingly clear, focused on me with an intensity that made my skin prickle. "Father," he rasped, pulling the mask aside with trembling fingers. "She came again last night." His hand clutched at mine, the skin paper-thin over protruding bones. "The nurse in the old uniform. She sits with me when the pain gets bad." I pulled up a chair, the legs scraping against linoleum in the too-quiet room. As he spoke, a chill crawled up my spine, despite the ward's stifling heat. He described her perfectly. The starched white dress, the outdated cap pinned to chestnut hair, the way her fingers passed slightly through his wrist when she checked his pulse. "She tells me not to be afraid," he whispered. "Says the crossing isn't hard if you know the way." Nurse Carter was waiting outside when I emerged. Before I could speak, she pulled a yellowed photograph from her pocket. The black and white image showed a nursing staff lineup from 1978. Her finger tapped one face in particular, a woman with kind eyes and a gentle smile. Her uniform identical to Mr. Howard's description. "Helen Pierce," Carter said quietly. "Worked this ward for 35 years. Died in 1987. The hallway seemed to tilt around me. Mr. Howard had been admitted just 3 weeks ago. He couldn't have known about Helen, couldn't have described that particular shade of her eyes, the way she used to hum Danny Boy while changing IV bags, a detail only the oldest staff remembered. That night, I reviewed the security footage from Mr. Howard's room. The timestamp read 2:13 a.m. when his heart monitor flatlined. The code team rushed in at 2:15, but the camera caught what human eyes missed. For 12 seconds after death, the sheets near Mr. Howard's hand depressed slightly, as if someone unseen was stroking them. Then just before the crash cart arrived, a faint shimmer resolved into the outline of a woman in an old-fashioned nurse's cap. The footage glitched as she leaned down, her spectral lips moving near the dead man's ear. When I enhanced the audio, all I caught was a whisper. "Easy now, my dear. The night's almost over." The next morning, I found Nurse Carter in the records room, her face streaked with tears. She'd discovered something in Helen's personnel file, not the official version, but the handwritten notes from the night she died. Turns out, Helen didn't pass peacefully in her sleep, as the records claimed. She'd collapsed right here in this ward, while comforting a dying patient, her own heart giving out as she held his hand through his final breaths. Carter looked up at me, her voice breaking. "Don't you see? She's not haunting this place. She's still doing her rounds." I used to think hospitals were places where life and death waged constant battle. Now I understand there's something far more complex. Intersections where the departed sometimes linger, not out of anger or unfinished business, but because love and duty can transcend even the final breath. Mr. Holloway showed me the terror of the unresolved dead. The man in the hallway revealed death's quiet messengers. The woman with black eyes taught me about vengeance that outlives the grave. But Helen changed everything. Because sometimes what we call ghosts are simply those who loved too deeply to leave. The next time you walk an empty hospital corridor late at night and feel an unexpected chill, don't be afraid. Listen closely. That whisper, just beyond hearing, might not be a warning, but a comfort. And if you're very lucky, you might catch a glimpse of white fabric rounding a distant corner, or hear the faintest hum of Danny Boy from an empty room. The dead walk these halls, it's true, but not all of them come for us. Some are still keeping watch, still holding vigil. So the next time you're in a hospital and see a nurse walking the night shift alone, take a closer look at her uniform. Check the style of her cap. Notice whether her shoes make sound against the floor. And if she turns to you with eyes full of decades-old compassion, don't look away. Just smile and let her work. After all, who are we to tell an angel her shift is over? But our journey through these haunted halls doesn't end here. If these stories sent chills down your spine, smash that like button. It lets us know you want more terrifying true tales from the front line, between life and death. Subscribe and hit the notification bell, because next week we're investigating something even darker. A pediatric ward where the toys move by themselves after midnight. And tell us in the comments, would you spend a night alone in these haunted hospitals? Your stories might just become our next video. Until then, sleep tight, if you can.